Hello, and welcome back to our read through of the entire Bible in 2026. We are moving into the second week of March, and so we are going to be reading this week from the book of Judges all the way to the end of the book of Ruth. And so we're starting in Judges chapter 4. And just as a quick reminder, the book of Judges basically starts off with this main premise that Israel has no king, and so the people do what they want. And that often leads them into trouble, and then God has to raise up a judge to get them out of trouble. And so we read about a couple of the early judges last week. This week we are looking into some of the main ones that you kind of always hear the stories about. We start with Deborah and Barak. Now, Barak is the one who kind of acts as the judge, but Deborah, a prophetess, kind of guides him and actually guides him into battle and gives him battle strategy and tells him to trust in God, and that will bring him success. And when he is kind of a little bit timid about it, Deborah says, well, okay, because you did not have faith that God would bring you victory by yourself, because you're asking me to go with you, the victory for this battle is actually going to belong to a woman and not to a man. And lo and behold, when they enter into this battle, the enemy commander runs away and is ended up killed by a woman named Jael, as he's trying to hide from the Israelite army. Now, moving into Judges chapter 6 and 7, we get to this very interesting point where, this is several years later. There's another kingdom now opposing Israel, and God chooses a man named Gideon, who is a young man from the smallest tribe and from the smallest clan of the smallest tribe to save Israel. And Gideon, in wanting to make sure that God was actually speaking to him, puts out a fleece. We call it the sign of a fleece. And he says, okay, if I wake up tomorrow morning and there's dew on the ground, but the fleece is completely dry, then I will know that God is speaking to me. And when it happens, Gideon goes for it, and he gathers up an army, and God tells him, that's too big. And so they end up shrinking down the army until it's just 300 men. And when they go to fight against the Midianites, Gideon shows up with his 300 men. He gives them all trumpets. He gives them all torches. And in the middle of the night, they light the torches and blow the trumpets, and the enemy thinks they're surrounded, and they end up fighting each other. And so Gideon saves Israel. But then things start to take an interesting turn, and not for the better. There are descendants of Gideon, Abimelech, who tries to take over Israel through force, and this leads to him fighting against some other Israelites and some other tribes. And so then and then it starts to evolve, and God has to raise up new judges to rescue Israel from itself. We get to a judge called Jephthah in chapter 11, who is this great warrior, but he's kind of an outcast because he was born of an illegitimate union between a man and someone who was not his wife. And so they come begging for him to help, and he says, well, if I'm going to help, you got to promise that I will be made like the ruler of these lands. And they say, okay. And then during the battle, Jephthah makes a vow and says, if God gives me victory, then the first thing that comes to see me after I come home, that I will sacrifice. And when he gets home from the battle, it's his own daughter. And he has to keep his vow. And so even there's tragedy. Now, then there's several judges who they're only basically warlords, and they're not really fighting against Israel's enemies. They're more gathering power for themselves. And so these judges that God was raising up to save Israel and to lead them into the future, they're starting to become more and more just pocket warlords trying to gain control for themselves. In chapter 13, we get into arguably the most famous judge, Samson, whom God gifts with this miraculous power and strength. On the regulations that Samson follows 3 rules. He doesn't touch anything that's dead, he doesn't drink wine, and he doesn't ever cut his hair. The only issue is, as Samson goes through, basically stumbling through life, when you really read it, he kind of puts himself into circumstances and has to fight his way out. He does this again and again and again, and as he goes through his life, he definitely touches dead carcasses. He probably drinks wine on multiple occasions. And then when he is met with Delilah, this woman that he thinks that he could love, she convinces him to cut his hair. And then his strength leaves him and he's captured by the Philistines. And it's only after he turns back to God, after being bound and blinded and devoid of his strength, that Samson is given strength one last time to defeat as many of the Philistines as possible. From there, the book of Judges takes this interesting place where all of a sudden there aren't really that many more judges. And we start to see that a prophet and a Benjaminite and a Levite, they kind of all get tangled into these different messes, and eventually it leads to a war with 11 of the tribes all against Benjamin, because everyone's trying to fight for themselves. But then when Benjamin finally surrenders, they have to find wives for the remaining Benjaminites, because they can't lose an entire tribe of God's people. And so women are taken captive. And the book of Judges ends in a really sad and scary point, especially compared to Joshua. Joshua was all hope. We're going to take the promised land. Now they're in the promised land. They haven't really gotten rid of all of their enemies. A bunch of their enemies are still around, and they've driven them back a few times. But now they're in tribal civil war. They need someone who can come and unite them. And they're just not getting it. Now, on Saturday this week, you'll be reading through the book of Ruth. It's only 4 chapters. It's a short book. It's the Hallmark movie of Bible stories. But it follows this woman, Ruth, who is a Moabite woman who married an Israelite man, but then he died, and so she's living with her Hebrew mother-in-law, and they go back to Israel, and they have nothing, because women without husbands in those days had nothing to their name. And so she's basically working as a beggar when she catches the eye of a man named Boaz, who is a kinsman redeemer, the next of kin, who can take her in as his wife and secure her future. And so, of course, this happens, and it's a very fun, very interesting tale. Like I said, it's the Hallmark movies of Bible stories. But Ruth ends up becoming the great-grandmother of King David, the one who's going to fix all the problems left behind at the end of the book of Judges. And to get into that story, we'll have to continue next week.